Tune into Nice Radio every Saturday at 7:30 a.m. for A View from the Outside, hosted by Brereton Horne. A View from the Outside takes a look at key issues affecting St Vincent and the Grenadines and gives a global perspective on how these issues are viewed. Host Brereton Horne will examine a variety of topics to enlighten, stimulate debate, and explore solutions. Hear the facts, hear the real-life stories, hear A View from the Outside. Join Brereton Horne at 7:30 a.m. every Saturday on Nice Radio for A View from the Outside.
This society needs a spectacle. It might help us to see some people.
On A View from the Outside this week being the 6th of February 2021, we look at trust, T-R-U-S-T, trust, with the view being that as COVID-19 and its effects and other perils wreak havoc in St Vincent and the Grenadines, more and more Vincentians do not trust the information coming from the regime, and as such, the country and its people run the risk of sinking further into degradation and despair. The Cambridge Dictionary states that trust is to believe that someone is good and honest and will not harm you, or that something is safe and reliable. And the Oxford Dictionary defines trust as a firm belief in the reliability, truth, or ability of someone or something. Those definitions tell us that to trust someone or something is to believe firmly that you can depend on the truthfulness of that someone or something. To trust someone or something is to believe strongly that you can rely on that someone or something. To trust someone or something is to believe earnestly in the safety of that someone or something. So in that context, if you do not trust something, you feel that it is not safe or reliable. And similarly, it is in that context that it is often said, he or she is such a liar, you can't trust a word which he or she says. It is with all of that in mind, and especially based on the regime's past and current performance, that we here on A View from the Outside have observed that more and more Vincentians do not trust information coming from the regime. The pandemic COVID-19 has wreaked devastation and has caused untold death and destruction in many countries around the world. Over 457,000 deaths in the US and over 110,000 in the UK alone. It therefore would be an understatement to say the least that COVID-19 has caused tremendous challenges to many. However, be that as it may, and even taking into account the inevitable challenges which COVID-19 poses, the way the pandemic has been handled by those concerned in St Vincent and the Grenadines has left many bewildered, befuddled, untrusting, and totally incredulous of what has transpired since COVID-19 was declared a pandemic. Their response has been shambolic at best. Right from the outset, there appeared to have been a reluctance by those entrusted with the nation's health and security to take the pandemic seriously. Those in government seemed more concerned about squeezing every last dollar from whom they could, rather than putting measures in place to combat a disease, a pandemic, which everyone has warned will inevitably be on the doorsteps of the Vincentian people. Their interest in squeezing every last dollar, it seems, is apparently to compensate for their absolute mismanagement of the country's economy. It was unfathomable that when countries were closing their borders and putting measures in place to try to combat the spread of COVID-19, the Prime Minister of St Vincent and the Grenadines was proposing a reduction in airfare as an incentive for people to travel to St Vincent and the Grenadines. Rather than being proactive and coming up with solutions, members of the regime, its agents and enablers were quick to ridicule and denigrate anyone who followed the trajectory of the pandemic and offering help and information which the country so desperately yearned for. It had to take the opposition leader to use his initiative and lead the charge by appearing in videos and audio recordings played nationally on radios, etc., and on social media, encouraging citizens to observe the basic protocols, including washing hands, sneezing in the crook of your elbow, and wearing masks. It took months for the state machinery to kick into any sort of gear to try to disseminate basic information on how to combat the spread of the disease. When they eventually did, their efforts seemed ad hoc and piecemeal. This caused many to be disbelieving and not wanting to trust some of the information which they eventually gave. For months, the regime continued to allow flights into the country, especially flights which were coming from countries where COVID-19 was and still is rampant. They even allowed people into the country and out of quarantine, specifically November 9th elections, to vote for them. Many saw that move as a move by a regime which was desperate to cling on to power rather than look out for the health and safety of its citizens. Many wondered and continue to wonder about the regime's proclaimed concern for the Vincentian people. Many have said that getting information from them is like pulling teeth, and when information is eventually divulged, many question the veracity and legality of that information. It seems that many are ignorant and left in the dark even pertaining to some of the rules which govern quarantine. Many people are unaware of the fact that an exemption exists for some people to quarantine at their homes rather than the alternative of an expensive hotel. At any time, and especially in a pandemic, rules need to be clear, unambiguous, and conspicuously available for everyone. People must not be made to suffer indignity for being unaware of rules which seem to be known only to a few. Well, the regime's seeming lackadaisical approach to combating COVID-19 appears to have come back to haunt it. There is no question that many have warned that things will get worse in St Vincent and the Grenadines. Many have said that if the regime did not take more stringent measures to fight COVID-19, then it is the people of St Vincent and the Grenadines that will bear the brunt of the onslaught. It did not need a prophet to predict that things will get worse, because many saw it coming. St Vincent and the Grenadines is now swarmed with COVID-19. The place is overrun. The numbers pertaining to those infected are swelling daily, and the number pertaining to deaths is rising. It is now very little wonder that there is a mad scramble by the regime to try to put measures in place. There is now, yes, only now, mention of a public health emergency. There is mention of mandatory mask wearing. All these are measures which ought to have been put in place many months ago, just like countries within the OECS, CARICOM, and countries around the world have done. At this critical time, when people need to hear from the administrators, it appears that they are holding back on the people. They have become Trumpian by having a press conference and refusing to take any questions. People have certainly lost trust. They, for months, denied that there is community spread of COVID-19 in St Vincent and the Grenadines. They even took the WHO to task on that, only to shamelessly now admit in the most recent press conference that there is indeed community spread in the country. No wonder they avoided questions in that press conference. You, the Vincentian people, certainly deserve better. You have been treated too badly, too callously by a regime which professes to care for you. It is small wonder that your trust is waning apace. To compound the people's dwindling trust, the head of the regime, who at one time flouted and castigated some of the basic protocols, including the shaking of hands, wearing of masks, and the numbers that could gather at events, including funerals, is now casting doubt, inadvertently or otherwise, in the minds of the people pertaining to the vaccine, which his government is responsible for bringing into the country from Russia to give to the Vincentian people. He has been reported as saying that he will have to give prayerful consideration before deciding whether to take the vaccine. Many say that perhaps he is taking the advice of the prophet in London, whom he seems to have in his craw, since that prophet addressed him directly in a series of prophecy. The Vincentian people need leadership, especially at this critical and crucial and uncertain juncture in the country's existence. They're dithering and lagging behind most other countries. Even neighboring countries only serve to expose the inadequacy and ineptitude in handling the pandemic. And it certainly creates a lack of trust in the people. Such lack of trust is not only exposed by the regime's dismal handling of COVID-19. The way the issue of dengue fever was handled and continues to be handled also leaves a lot to be desired. Just like in the case of COVID-19, when people needed and need information in relation to dengue fever, very little or none is forthcoming. Just like COVID-19, people do not trust some of the official figures which are drip-fed to the public. Dengue fever is still a real and present threat in the country, and people still yearn for more correct information. The lack of trust is also brought on by the regime's seeming unwillingness to have timeously informed Vincentians of the early activities at the volcano at La Soufrière. People have become so distrustful that some even put themselves in harm's way and made the dangerous climb to the summit and descended into the volcanic crater to try to bring credible information to their Vincentian counterparts. Vincentians need more information, credible information pertaining to evacuation points, information on transportation, information on evacuation centers, etc., etc. Because the danger of a possible explosive eruption is looming large. Those in the danger zones need to know what to take with them. They need now more than ever to be educated about the protocols pertaining to COVID-19, especially when possible overcrowding may become inevitable in some centers in the event that they have to be evacuated. There are so many other things which have happened over the 20-year life of this regime, which have all contributed to the people's lack of trust in them, that to list them all here is simply not possible. Due to the limitation of time, therefore, we here on A View from the Outside encourage you to exercise your powers of recall and identify many of those things, including the many lies. And when you have done so, continue the conversation with your colleagues and remind the regime of them and demand better and demand more. As you do that, don't forget the lack of trust caused by their lack of accountability, financial accountability to the Vincentian people. Don't forget the lack of trust caused by the promise made just a few weeks prior to the last general elections to pay Marcus de Freitas. Yet, no such payment has been made. And yet, they have proposed to build a new parliament on the said property, for which they continuously defy a court order and refuse to pay Marcus de Freitas. Don't forget the lack of trust caused by their complete refusal to release the results of the poverty assessment. Don't forget the lack of trust caused by the failure of the promise to carry out a thorough investigation into the allegation of millions of US dollars which are alleged to be held in bank accounts overseas by some of those in the upper echelons of the regime. Don't forget the lack of trust caused by their complete neglect of the agricultural industry and their pronouncement that agriculture is a thing of the past. Only to now, in the most recent budget debate, pronounce that agriculture is at the core of the Vincentian identity. And also, don't forget the lack of trust caused by the much vaunted geothermal project, which has failed miserably and spectacularly. A project of which no mention is made nowadays. Vincentians, have a think and keep the conversation going. Until next week, Justin and all of the listeners, this is Brereton Horne with A View from the Outside, with a reminder to send your feedback as usual to aviewfromtheoutside@hotmail.com. We also invite you to visit and like our Facebook page at A View from the Outside, and also visit and subscribe to our YouTube channel at JMB Horne. Have a pleasant Saturday, Justin and all of the listeners. Have a wonderful Sunday and have a productive week ahead.